The first time someone noticed something was wrong, it was because the dogs refused to cross the eastern field. They whined at the tree line, where the cotton thinned, and the soil turned dark and soft, as if the ground itself had been breathing there for too long. The overseer cursed and tugged their chains, but the animals dug in, nails scraping dirt, eyes fixed on nothing anyone else could see. That was where the twin sisters worked. No one could remember exactly when the girls arrived. Plantation ledgers listed their purchase in careful ink, 2 names written so similarly they blurred at a glance, but the date had been scratched over. Once, twice, then pressed so hard the paper nearly tore. The trader who brought them downriver swore they were healthy, strong, and inseparable, and the master, against his usual habits, paid extra to keep them that way. They looked alike enough to unsettle even those accustomed to sameness, same narrow shoulders, same deep set eyes, same scar along the left palm. But it was the way they stood that troubled people most. Never side by side, never touching, always a few paces apart, as if distance itself were part of an agreement. The field hands whispered that the sisters did not sleep at the same time. That when one worked, the other watched. That when the whip fell on one back, the other flinched and bled later, in private. Once, a woman swore she heard 2 voices crying from a single throat after sundown, rising from the cabins like steam from hot earth. The master forbade questions. He forbade counting. Yet numbers refused to behave. Rations ran short when they should not have. Tools went missing only to reappear clean and warm at dawn. A child was born in the quarters bearing a mark, shaped like a thumbprint pressed too hard, and the midwife crossed herself and said nothing. By the time the river rose that year and swallowed the eastern field whole, people had already learned not to look too closely at the twins. Because whenever someone tried to follow them with their eyes for too long, the world seemed to stutter, just for a moment, as if history itself had forgotten how many of them there were, and it never remembered correctly again. The arrival of the twin sisters did not announce itself with ceremony or alarm, which is precisely why it unsettled those who later tried to remember it. In Mississippi, enslaved people were bought and sold with numbing regularity, bodies moving downriver like cargo, names recorded and forgotten in the same breath. Yet, when the twins came, memory grew thin and unreliable, as if the event resisted being fully held. Some claimed it was early spring, others swore it was already summer, but all agreed the air had been heavy, pressing low over the land when the trader's wagon rolled through the gates and stopped too close to the main house. They were young, perhaps 16 or 17, though hardship made age an unreliable thing. The trader described them as sound stock, strong-backed and quick-eyed, but he hesitated before speaking, pausing just long enough for discomfort to creep in. He insisted they were to be sold together, a condition he repeated twice, then a third time, as though he feared it might slip away if not spoken aloud. The plantation owner, a man known for separating kin without hesitation, surprised everyone by agreeing. He did more than agree. He paid above market value, pressing silver into the trader's palm with an urgency that unsettled even him. The reason was never given. No illness explained it, no skill that required partnership, no visible defect that demanded special handling. The twins stood several paces apart while the transaction took place, eyes lowered, hands empty, yet the space between them felt crowded, charged with something unnamed. When one shifted her weight, the other did not mirror the movement, yet the change rippled between them all the same, like a shared breath taken out of time. A field hand later said it felt as though the space itself belonged to them more than the ground beneath their feet. Plantation rules discouraged keeping siblings together, especially twins. It was said they bred defiance, memory, an unhelpful sense of self that did not break cleanly under punishment. The overseer objected, quietly at first, reminding the master of efficiency and discipline. His concerns were waved away. The master's gaze lingered on the girls not with desire, but with calculation, as if he were studying a locked door he believed he already had the key to. He ordered them assigned to the eastern field, away from the quarters, away from routine oversight, where the soil was darker and yields had always been unpredictable. The ledger entry that recorded their purchase would later become a point of fixation. 2 names were written, nearly identical, their letters curling into one another, followed by a date that had been overwritten until it lost all meaning. The ink was heavier there, pressed deep, the paper scarred. It was the only entry on that page altered in such a way. The clerk, who kept the books, could not recall making the correction. Yet the pressure of the pen suggested anger or fear, emotions he insisted had no place in his work. From the first week, small irregularities followed the twins. They were counted twice at dusk and still came up wrong. A roll call listed one absent when both stood present. Food prepared for 2 seemed to feed more. Tools issued to them returned worn in ways that suggested longer use than daylight allowed. None of this was dramatic enough to prompt action, yet each detail lodged itself in the mind, accumulating weight. The enslaved people noticed first. They always did. They learned to watch the twins without staring, to listen without asking, to step carefully around the silence that followed them. Most unsettling was the master's insistence that they never be separated, even briefly. When illness swept the quarters, he ordered both confined, though only one showed symptoms. When labor was short-handed, he refused to reassign either, preferring lost productivity to breaking whatever rule he had decided mattered more. Once, during an argument with the overseer, he said, "They function as intended," then fell silent, as though surprised by his own words. The twins themselves spoke little, and when they did, their voices were ordinary, unremarkable, offering no explanation for the attention paid to them. Yet their presence bent routines, altered decisions, and introduced a subtle wrongness that could not be traced to any single cause. Their arrival marked a quiet deviation in the life of the plantation, a moment when something was accepted without understanding, allowed to take root because it was easier than questioning why a man who never wasted money had paid so much to keep 2 enslaved girls together, for reasons he never put into words and never needed to, because from the moment they stepped onto the land, the place itself seemed to recognize them as something it had been waiting for. The bond between the twin sisters revealed itself slowly, not through spectacle, but through repetition, through small disturbances that returned too often to be dismissed as coincidence. At first it appeared as nothing more than familiarity, the closeness expected of siblings who had survived the same losses. They worked within sight of each other in the eastern field, never straying far, yet rarely exchanging words. Overseers mistook their quiet for obedience. It took time to understand that silence was the language they shared most fluently. People began to notice how one would pause mid-motion, hand hovering over a cotton bowl, spine held rigid, as if listening for something beyond sound. Seconds later, the other would falter, sometimes gasping, sometimes swaying on her feet. When asked if she was ill, she would shake her head, eyes unfocused, breath shallow, as though recovering from a pain that had not happened to her body, but had passed through it. On days like that, the first twin bore no outward sign of distress, working steadily while something unseen echoed between them. Punishment made the pattern impossible to ignore. When one sister was lashed for moving too slowly, the other did not cry out, did not flinch in the moment. She watched with a stillness so complete it unnerved the overseer, who later said it felt like striking a reflection rather than a person. That night, in the quarters, the unpunished sister was found curled on the dirt floor, back raw with welts no whip had made. The wounds matched in number, if not in shape, as though pain had taken a longer, more thoughtful path to reach her. Whispers spread, cautious and fearful. Some said the twins had been cursed before they were sold, bound by something older than scripture. Others claimed they had done it to themselves, that they shared blood in a way no one was meant to, sealing their bodies together with a vow spoken in desperation. A woman who had once known twins herself insisted it was simpler than that some children were born unable to tell where one ended and the other began, and the world punished them for the confusion. No explanation fit for long. Stranger still were the moments when distance failed them entirely. When illness struck one, the other weakened even if kept apart. Once, after a storm split the eastern field in two, the twins were assigned to opposite sides of the damage. By midday, both had collapsed, shaking and fevered, despite no shared water, no shared air. The overseer separated them further, suspecting deception, and both worsened, as if space itself were an injury. Only when they were returned within sight of each other did their breathing steady, though neither fully recovered. Speech, when it came, followed its own rules. One sister would begin a sentence and falter, and the other would finish it, not by echoing the words, but by completing the thought, sometimes using phrasing that suggested the idea had already been shared before it was spoken aloud. They were never seen whispering together, never conspiring in corners, yet knowledge passed between them with unnerving ease. Questions asked of one were sometimes answered by the other, eyes locked on a point just beyond the listener, as if responding to something internal rather than external. The enslaved people learned to watch for signs. A sudden intake of breath, a hand pressed flat against the chest, a momentary loss of balance. These gestures became warnings, subtle signals that something had shifted between the sisters. Children were told not to interrupt them when this happened. Elders stepped aside, offering quiet space, the way one might for grief or prayer. Whatever bound the twins demanded respect, and those who had learned to survive knew better than to challenge forces they did not understand. The master observed all of this with an interest that bordered on satisfaction. He ordered no investigation, dismissed calls for separation, and punished those who speculated too openly. Once, he was heard saying that the bond was proving resilient, as though it were an experiment unfolding according to design. The ledger reflected this obsession in its own way. Injuries recorded under one name would later appear under the other, dates misaligned, notes added in the margins as if trying to reconcile two bodies that refused to remain singular. Over time, the twins' bond began to feel less like a connection and more like a system, a closed circuit of sensation and awareness that operated beneath the visible life of the plantation. They aged at the same rate despite unequal labor. They healed unevenly but finished healing together. When one smiled, the other did not need to see it to know. When one dreamed, the other woke with tears already falling. The distinction between them remained, yet it thinned, stretched, and blurred in ways that unsettled everyone who witnessed it, because it suggested that identity itself was not as fixed as the world demanded it be, and that under the right conditions, two lives could be made to carry a single, unbearable weight, without ever being allowed to set it down the ledger. Should have been the most reliable thing on the plantation, more dependable than memory, more authoritative than rumor. It was where bodies were reduced to ink, where labor, loss, and value were flattened into columns that could be tallied without emotion. Yet sometime after the twins' arrival, the book began to behave as strangely as the land itself. At first, the inconsistencies were subtle enough to excuse a miscount here, a correction there, the kinds of errors that crept in when days blurred together. But as seasons passed, the numbers stopped agreeing with one another in ways that could no longer be blamed on fatigue or carelessness. Deaths were recorded that no one remembered witnessing. A name would be crossed out, marked deceased, only for the same name to reappear weeks later in a work assignment, written in the same hand, with no note of revival or mistake. Births were listed without mothers, children added to inventory without explanation, their ages misaligned from the moment they were written down. Punishments appeared twice for a single offense, then vanished altogether, as if they had never happened. The ledger began to read less like a record and more like an argument with itself. The twins' names appeared more often than anyone else's, sometimes together, sometimes alone, sometimes written so close they seemed to overlap. Injuries logged under one sister's name were followed days later by medical notations under the other, describing wounds of similar severity but different origin. When questioned, the clerk insisted he was copying information as it was given to him, nothing more. He grew defensive when pressed, tapping the page with his finger, saying the book did not lie, even as his own entries contradicted one another. What unsettled people most was the arithmetic. The total number of enslaved people, listed at the end of each month, refused to remain consistent. Subtractions did not reduce the sum. Additions did not increase it as expected. Sometimes the number remained the same despite documented deaths. Other times it shifted by one with no corresponding explanation. The master noticed this too, though he said little. Instead of ordering an audit or replacing the clerk, he instructed that the final tally be copied forward regardless, preserving the error as though it were intentional. Those who could read began to compare pages in secret. They traced dates with their fingers, whispered names under their breath, trying to reconcile what they knew with what was written. The ledger described a plantation that existed only on paper, populated by people who were both present and absent, punished and unpunished, alive and dead in alternating ink. At the center of this distortion were the twins, their entries behaving like mirrors placed too close together, reflecting and multiplying until no single image could be trusted. One entry, in particular, drew quiet attention. It recorded the death of one twin during a fever outbreak, complete with date, cause, and the customary note about reduced labor capacity. The following week, both twins were listed as working the eastern field, their output noted as above average. No correction was made to the death record. Instead, the next page contained a marginal note, questioning whether the original count had been accurate, written in a different hand, then struck through so forcefully the paper tore. The implication lingered unspoken. The book could not decide how many bodies it was meant to account for. The ledger began to feel less like a tool and more like a witness struggling to describe something that refused to be contained by language or numbers. Each attempt to clarify only produced further contradictions. Ink bled through pages where names were written too heavily, staining earlier entries, collapsing time so that past and present touched. Dates repeated themselves. Lines were drawn between columns for no discernible reason, as if the clerk were trying to keep something from slipping out. The master's interest sharpened. He spent long evenings reviewing the book by lamplight, turning pages slowly, his finger lingering over the twins' names. He asked questions that made little sense to anyone else, inquiring not about productivity or profit, but about consistency. about whether an entry held from one page to the next. When told that the numbers did not align, he nodded, as though this confirmed something he already believed. By then, even those who could not read felt the ledger's influence. Rations were distributed according to figures that did not match the mouths present. Work assignments shifted inexplicably. A man was punished for an infraction dated weeks before it occurred. A woman mourned a child the book insisted had never existed. Reality bent itself to accommodate what was written, rather than the other way around, and the twins moved through this warped structure as though they were its axis. The ledger did not merely fail to explain the twins. It exposed the limits of explanation itself. It showed how easily a system built to control bodies unraveled when confronted with something it could not divide cleanly. 2 names, 2 columns, 2 bodies, yet the space between them refused to stay empty, filling instead with repetition, contradiction, and a quiet insistence that the truth was not missing, only multiplied beyond the book's ability to count. The night the river rose, the twins vanished. It began with rain, slow and persistent at first, turning into a relentless drumbeat against the tin roofs of the cabins, against the bare earth of the fields. By evening, the eastern field had begun to blur at its edges, the soil softening into a gray slurry that swallowed footprints and buried the low cotton stalks. The overseer swore he had never seen the river climb so fast, not in memory, not in any ledger. The master stood on the porch, lantern in hand, eyes fixed on the dark curve of water that snaked closer with every minute, and gave orders that no one understood. He told people to secure tools, to herd livestock, and then he left the twins' names off the list entirely. Those who had worked beside the sisters knew something more ominous was coming. The air was thick with static, the kind that prickled at skin and made hair stand on end, a weight that pressed down on lungs. The field hands whispered to each other that the girls should be brought inside, that no one could afford to lose them now, not after everything that had come before. But before any action could be taken, the river spilled over its banks, rolling with a force that made fences collapse, cabins tremble, and the low-lying land vanish beneath brown water. The twins were last seen at the field's edge, standing side by side, staring at the swelling river with a quiet stillness that did not belong to human bodies. They did not call for help. They did not run. They did not flinch when the current hit their ankles. For a moment, the water seemed to hesitate, curving around them rather than swallowing them entirely. As though even the river recognized the boundary it could not cross. Then, a wave higher than any before swept through, and the twins disappeared. By morning, the field was unrecognizable. Debris floated in endless brown ribbons, mud replaced what had once been soil, and the cotton was ruined, flattened, ruined by water and wind. The overseer counted, as he always did, hoping to account for every body, every tool, every animal. He came to the spot where the twins had stood and found nothing. He called the master. The master came and stared at the river, which had already begun to retreat, and nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if he had expected this outcome. Yet when he returned to the house, he added both twins' names to the ledger, assigning them to the eastern field, as though nothing had happened, and the clerk copied the entry without question. People noticed immediately that something was wrong. For one, the remaining workers swore that they saw 2 figures walking along the distant tree line, long after the flood had subsided, reflections in puddles where the earth had settled. They could hear voices calling in tandem, rising from the riverbed itself, and yet when anyone approached, there was only one girl visible, trembling on the edge of the property, drenched to the skin, eyes wide, silent as stone. She bore no sign of injury, no indication of struggle, though the fields around her bore the scars of chaos and destruction. The overseer demanded answers. The master insisted there were none, that the girl was lucky to be alive, that she must have clung to something beneath the flood. But even he seemed uneasy, touching the ledger with care, brushing his fingers over the names of both twins as though checking to ensure they still existed. He left the eastern field, leaving the girl in place, her reflection in a puddle unmoving, and returned to the house. From that night forward, both twins continued to appear in records. The one who had returned bore the same name she always had, though the ledger also insisted her sister had worked the fields, performed chores, and endured punishments in the days after the flood. People whispered about it quietly, the way one whispers about storms that never seem to end. Tools disappeared only to reappear where both girls had supposedly been working. Food rations were counted twice for one body, yet always ran short. Shadows moved with independent intention, flickering across walls, across fields, across water that had once carried one twin away. The girl who survived was never the same. Her sleep was broken, her voice barely audible, and her eyes often drifted toward spaces no one else could see. When she spoke, she occasionally referred to her sister, as though she were present, and sometimes she answered questions no one had asked aloud. The other workers noticed small anomalies, a footprint left in damp soil that did not match her shoes, a reflection in water that multiplied when the wind shifted, and an echo of laughter that could not belong to any living person. The master tried to dismiss these events, claiming they were figments of exhaustion, hysteria, or superstition. But the ledger refused to comply. Work entries continued to list both girls as active, producing yields as if the flood had never happened. Punishments were assigned, healing noted, illness recorded, all for a body that no one could confirm existed. People began to avoid the eastern field entirely after dark, murmuring that the water had taken more than it seemed, leaving something behind that moved through the plantation like a shadow of memory. And even as the seasons passed, and the river returned to its usual banks, the story of that night persisted in everything it touched. The surviving twin carried herself with a caution that no one understood. The land itself seemed altered, the air heavier along the river's curve, and the ledger, so rigid and immutable, continued to list both sisters, as though the river's claim had been insufficient to erase them. No one dared explain it fully, because there were no words strong enough to contain the strangeness, no logic capable of reconciling two names, one body, and the memory of a night when the river decided that boundaries did not apply the way humans believed. They shilled after emancipation. The land itself seemed unwilling to forget the twins. The plantation, long silent in the aftermath of war, carried the echoes of their presence in ways that no ledger, no memory, and no living witness could fully account for. Fields that should have yielded cotton lay fallow, or produced uneven harvests, stubborn against the labor of new owners. Trees along the eastern edge bent oddly, roots twisting beneath the soil, as if shaping themselves around something unseen. The river, which had once swallowed one sister and left both in records, never quite returned to its old course, creeping a little further each year, reshaping the earth in ways that made the boundaries of the property uncertain. The new owners arrived with optimism and ledgers of their own, intent on cataloging every living thing and every square foot of land. They discovered that records of past ownership were incomplete, chaotic, and occasionally impossible to reconcile. Notes from the previous master listed two twins working side by side, yet only one ever appeared in the quarter. The land itself seemed to resist documentation, fences rotted inexplicably, Crops grew in patches that ignored careful planning, and livestock behaved strangely, sometimes refusing to cross fields where the twins had once worked. Residents who had stayed behind spoke in hushed tones about the twins' lingering presence. Some claimed they could see the girls walking along the edges of the fields at dusk, their reflections mirrored in puddles, long after the sun had set. Others swore they heard soft singing carried by the wind, a melody neither familiar nor foreign, but impossible to locate. Children ran from the corners of the eastern field when the sound reached them, crying about sisters who appeared and disappeared, whose eyes followed you from the shadows of tree trunks. The adults spoke less, because speaking invited scrutiny and doubt, and because those who remembered the twins knew that the land itself had a memory sharper than any human mind. Efforts to occupy the property with new families, new crops, and new order always faltered. Machinery would break inexplicably in the eastern field, leaving deep gouges in the soil, as though something had moved beneath the surface. Rain would fall unevenly, soaking one half of a plot while leaving the other parched. Workers occasionally came back with bruises or small cuts that bore no explanation, and always in patterns that suggested symmetry, pairing one injury with another somewhere else on the land. It was as though the twins' presence had imprinted a rhythm onto the earth, and the land kept time long after they were gone. Artifacts of their lives remained scattered, relics that refused to settle into history. A scrap of cloth would appear tangled in fence wires, frayed identically on both ends. A single shoe would surface on the riverbank, only to be gone by the next morning, replaced by another in the same size and style. When doors were repaired, marks resembling fingerprints or palm prints appeared in the wood, unexplainable in a building that had been newly constructed. It was as if the twins had left behind something, neither visible nor corporeal, a residue that clung to earth and wood alike. Even those who tried to map the property noted irregularities. Survey lines would shift when revisited, and boundary markers sunk in the ground would tilt inexplicably toward the eastern field. Soil tests revealed inconsistencies, patches of fertility and barrenness that could not be accounted for, deposits that suggested long, forgotten cultivation patterns, and traces of human activity in places where no one had ever walked. Birds avoided certain trees entirely, while other wildlife seemed drawn to particular corners of the field, moving in ways that suggested recognition or fear. New tenants occasionally reported glimpses of two figures, standing together where one could have stood, voices overlapping in conversation but no mouths moving. At night, shadows flickered across walls, long after candle flames had died down. Some claimed the twins spoke to one another, though in tones not meant for human ears. Voices threaded with warning or lament, echoing through the cabins and across the fields. Those who tried to chase the sounds found themselves circling endlessly, arriving at the same spot over and over, as if the land itself were guiding them back to its center. The twins' names continued to appear in local documents long after emancipation, often in ways that defied logic. A ledger kept by a later tenant listed their labor, noting yields, injuries, and illnesses as though they still worked the soil. Letters from neighboring plantations mentioned seeing two figures moving in tandem along the river, never acknowledging their humanity directly, yet noting the uncanny precision of their steps. Oral histories, passed from generation to generation, treated the twins less as people and more as forces, entwined with the land, with the river, with the trees. Something that could not be owned, divided, or silenced. Even today, the eastern field is left mostly untended. Visitors report a sensation of being watched, a subtle pressure along the shoulders or the back, and sometimes hear laughter carried across the wind, that does not belong to any living person. The river remains capricious, flooding irregularly, shifting slightly each year, always curving closer to the remnants of the old cotton rows. Old trees lean toward one another in lines that suggest intention rather than growth. The soil is uneven, fertile in strange patches, and impossible to plow in straight rows. Those who study the history of the area sometimes dismiss the twins as legend, mere superstition layered over the cruelty of slavery. But for those who have walked the eastern field, counted the shadows along the riverbank, or listened to the wind threading through the old trees, it is impossible to separate the girls from the land. They left no home, no children, no descendants. Yet the plantation carries them in every crooked fence post, every patch of stubborn soil, every bend in the river that refuses to follow the maps made by men who believed they could command the earth. Their secret remains unreadable, recorded not in ink, not in memory, but in the land itself, which remembers with a patience and precision far beyond human comprehension.